If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. The Battle of the Wilderness ended on May 6th. Ulysses S. Grant, commander of all Union forces and making his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac, now had a decision to make. He hadn't made any headway in the thick underbrush of the wilderness, so he could either move east to Fredericksburg and fight along the main rail line to Richmond, or move in a more southeasterly direction and bypass Robert E. Lee's right flank to put his army in between Robert E. Lee's army and the Confederate capital at Richmond. He would choose the latter. Early on May 7th, Grant sent word to the commander of the Army of the Potomac, George Gordon Meade, to begin moving his men toward Spotsylvania Court House. Governor K. Warren's 5th Corps would lead the advance. Robert E. Lee, commanding the Army of Northern Virginia, wagered that Grant would move toward Spotsylvania Court House, especially since intelligence reports indicated that the river crossing equipment had been removed from the Rapidan River. On May 7th, Lee ordered Richard Anderson, the temporary commander of James Longstreet's corps after that general's wounding on May 6th, to pull his men away from the front lines at dark and prepare to march toward Spotsylvania Court House. Anderson would take a crude road that Lee ordered Brigadier General William Pendleton to construct, known as Pendleton's Road. A sharp engagement between Union General Philip Sheridan's cavalry and Confederate General Jeb Stuart's cavalry raged at Todd's Tavern, a key location on the Brock Road, the most direct route to Spotsylvania Court House. Union cavalry controlled Todd Tavern, but Confederate cavalry remained on the Brock Road, blocking the path for the Union's 5th Corps. Late in the day, on May 7th, Anderson's Corps and Warren's 5th Corps began moving toward the courthouse. Fitzhugh Lee and his cavalry guarded the intersection of the Brock Road and the Old Courthouse Road, but Federal horsemen were behind him, already at Spotsylvania Courthouse. Anderson's Corps, led by Joseph Kershaw's division, was approaching the intersection to help Lee's cavalry. The Confederate cavalrymen, oversaw by their corps commander Jeb Stuart and their division commander Fitzhugh Lee, cut down small pine trees to form a breastwork to defend against the approaching Union infantry. Warren's 5th Corps was now going to attempt to capture the intersection leading to Spotsylvania Court House. The 3rd and 2nd South Carolina arrived first and took the place of the rebel horsemen. Lyle's brigade of Robinson's division met stiff resistance from the Confederate infantry. The withering fire from the South Carolinians forced Lyle's men back, even before some of them came into battle line, but there were more blue troops coming. A member of the 2nd South Carolina remembered that when Union troops reached a large wild cherry tree on the right side of the road, the 3rd fired a solid and withering volley into it, and this was quickly followed by a similar volley by our regiment. The Federals seemed completely surprised, staggered, and as we continued our rain of lead into their ranks, broke and retreated in great disorder down the hill and took shelter in a woods in their rear. More rebels were making their way to the scene of the engagement. Anderson and Joseph Kershaw, not knowing the terrain, had Jeb Stuart place the infantry regiments as they came up. The rest of John Hennigan's troops filed to the left as Joseph Bartlett and Andrew Dennison's Union brigades reached the field. The Marylanders under Dennison were just as surprised to see Confederate infantry as Lyle's men were, and in a rush to attack, intermingled into a solid mass. In the attack by Dennison, John Robinson was shot in the knee, and Dennison was hit in the arm. Both men would lose their limbs to amputation. Charles Phelps, who took over as commander of Dennison's brigade, would be pinned under his horse. The Marylanders, after a brief fight, pulled away from the engagement. Joseph Bartlett was unsure about attacking the Confederate position. His division commander, Charles Griffin, ordered him to take the position, but Bartlett was concerned about the enemy's strength and artillery in front of him. When Bartlett insisted on Griffin looking at the situation personally, Griffin arrived and looked at the Confederate position. Griffin explained that all that was in front of them was a few dismounted cavalry, and for him to take it with the bayonet. Bartlett's men rushed into the woods concealing the South Carolinians. The Pennsylvanians on the brigade's right made it to the breastworks, but many were taken prisoner, as they were too tired to fight or run from the previous couple days of hard marching and fighting. Bartlett's men now fell back. Warren was in a desperate situation. He was to lead the Union Army to Spotsylvania Court House, but now 3 of his brigades had been thrown back. Warren had to clear the road. More of his brigades were now on the field, and he would try to dislodge the rebels again. Romaine Ayres's brigade advanced at a diagonal with Swatzer's 62nd Pennsylvania on their right, at almost a perpendicular angle to the Confederates. who threw flanking fire into the Union ranks. The attack didn't last long as the blue regiments faded from the field. Warren now only had Jacob Schweitzer's brigade and Richard Coulter's brigade available to attack, but Schweitzer's brigade was spread out, guarding artillery batteries, so Coulter was left to attack the Confederate works. Reports are scarce as to what happened during Coulter's attack, or even in what formation the men were in, but apparently they got close enough to the rebel breastworks to plant at least one flag on the entrenchments, then were pushed back. To the southeast, Wilson's cavalry, who stayed in control of Spotsylvania Court House during the opening phase of the engagement, would lose control of the location when Goodbrine and William Wofford's brigades approached from the south, which made Confederate control of the Brock Road and the Old Courthouse Road intersection more secure. Lysander Cutler, former commander of the Iron Brigade, now rode at the head of William Wadsworth's division when that division commander got mortally wounded in the Wilderness. The division now marched down the Brock Road, ready to be fed into the fortified Confederate position. More than just the Union division under Cutler made it to the field. Charles Field's division of Anderson's Corps also made it to the intersection of the Old Courthouse Road and the Brock Road, bent on preventing Grant from getting to the courthouse. When the three brigades of Cutler attacked, each brigade faced trouble. Rice's front line, made up of the 95th New York and the 52nd Pennsylvania, got turned back from the Spindle Farm amidst the burning of the Spindle home, which had been targeted by Confederate artillery because Union sharpshooters used it as a concealed location to fire on the rebel lines. Edward Bragg and William Robinson ran into part of William Perry's Alabama Brigade, who had also advanced against the approaching Federal soldiers. With flanking fire hitting them, as well as gunfire from the front, Cutler's division pulled back. It was now about 11:30 a.m. on May 8th, and the Army of Northern Virginia was making a stand on the Brock Road. Each side now rushed troops to the precarious sector. Grant was unlike other Union generals Lee had faced. Such a stubborn stand in the Wilderness may have convinced other Union generals to retreat, but Grant was moving south. When the soldiers in the Army of the Potomac began their march toward Spotsylvania Court House, they cheered because they were heading toward Richmond, not like the other times where a hard-fought battle resulted in a Northern withdrawal. Major General Governor K. Warren had been a rising star in the Army of the Potomac, and when Ulysses S. Grant placed his headquarters with that army, he had great hope in that commander, and even believed he would be a good replacement for the Army commander George Meade if that was needed. However, the first 2 weeks in May dashed Grant's optimism about Warren. The 5th Corps commander was hesitant in the Wilderness, and now, in the opening stages of the Battle of Spotsylvania Court House, he had thrown his brigades in piecemeal against an entrenched Confederate line. Warren informed Meade that he was now entrenched, but Meade wanted him to attack. Warren's divisions were just too bloodied from the fight on the morning of May 8th. However, Meade informed him that John Sedgwick and his 6th Corps was on the way to support Warren. After a brief stop over at Chancellorsville, where his men ate lunch, Sedgwick's men marched on to join Warren in the quickly erupting battle. The hesitant Warren would wait on Sedgwick. Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps was following Sedgwick's corps, and Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps moved south to Todd's Tavern. One of Sedgwick's soldiers remembered the hard march in the May heat. The heat was intense, the undergrowth shutting off any breeze, the dust ankle deep and light as air, so that the atmosphere was filled with it. Many of the men suffered from sunstroke, fallen in the ranks, and were lifted to the roadside by comrades. Ewell's corps slipped behind Anderson's troops and moved to the east. Hill's corps would be the last to start marching toward Spotsylvania Court House, leaving around 3 p.m., but not with Hill at its head. Prostatitis debilitated Hill so much so that he needed to be temporarily replaced. Lee would choose Jubal Early to take command of Hill's corps. Ewell placed his divisions to the right of Anderson's men. Both Meade and Grant wanted Warren and Sedgwick to attack the Confederate line immediately, but Sedgwick wanted to be briefed on the situation in his front from Warren, so the attack was delayed. At around 6 p.m., Warren rode up to the New Jersey Brigade near the Brock Road and ordered it forward. The 3rd New Jersey was in a skirmish line, with the 15th New Jersey in line of battle behind them. When they stepped off, they found they were the only ones moving forward. The men from New Jersey miraculously made it to the breastworks of the rebels, but because both of their flanks were exposed, they couldn't remain there long, and retreated back across the field. The attack wasn't just supposed to involve the men from New Jersey. Brigades to their right and left were supposed to move out as well, but Sedgwick's men to the left were called off from attacking, and the ones to the right didn't move either. Another attack was being planned, which would see the brigades of Joseph Fisher and William Talley from Crawford's division, and a conglomeration of regiments from Schweitzer's and Bartlett's brigades, made up of the 20th Maine, 118th Pennsylvania, 16th Michigan, and some soldiers from the 9th and 22nd Massachusetts, all led by Colonel Charles Herring of the 118th Pennsylvania. The men were poised to strike the right flank of the Confederate line, but some of Ewell's brigades were making it to the field before the attack was made. At 6:30 p.m., the three brigades stepped off to attack the Confederate flank, but ran into Benjamin Humphreys' Mississippians, supported by Cullen Battle's Alabamians. Major General Robert Rhodes, Battle's division commander, rode up to his old brigade and yelled, "Boys, you played hell the other evening. Now, when the order is given, I want you to run over those Yankees in front." The Alabamians attacked and sent the front line under Talley to the rear, but Fisher's line made a stubborn stand. However, the growing darkness made Fisher afraid that who he was firing on were members of Talley's troops, so he ordered a ceasefire. Battle kept up the gunfire, and Fisher's men melted away, leaving the brigade under Herring alone. Herring wouldn't be outdone and ordered his regiments to throw volleys into the Alabamians. Each side kept up a steady fire, killing and maiming a good many. The 61st Alabama approached the flank of the Union brigade, but the 16th Michigan blocked their flanking attempt. A member of the 20th Maine remembered, "Our men were in just the right mood to fight, weary, hungry, discouraged, mad. In such a condition, it is as easy to die as to run," and so they decided to hold their position until ordered to leave. A Confederate rode of the melee. Swords clashed and revolvers that had never left their holsters to be discharged in anger were freely used. Shouts, yells, imprecations, heard above the noise of battle were incessant. Alone, a mile beyond relief, menaced by death or captivity, the men were in a mood to fight and fight hard. Front, rear, and flanks were lost in the whirl. Organization was gone, each man depended upon himself. Darkness increased the confusion, and the result hung upon personal tenacity. Shouting helped to encourage the combatants, and ours, deeper, louder, more determined, was the most assuring. As Battle and Herring engaged in a fierce fight, three more Union brigades assembled for an attack. Henry Eustis's brigade began to act erratically, and when Sedgwick asked what was wrong, the commander of the 37th Massachusetts said that Eustis was drunk and that he could organize the men himself. Sedgwick agreed, and Eustis was walked back to the rear. The three brigades advanced, but the darkness and the foliage made it difficult to keep the battle lines together. One soldier remembered that his regiment advanced from half to 3/4 of a mile, and the enemy developed in such strong force that, owing to the approach of darkness and the weariness of his men, he concluded it best not to force the fight, and withdrew his attacking lines a short distance. Some brigades slowed down, and others sped up. More brigades from Robert Rhodes' division counterattacked. Both sides fired volleys, but it was difficult to fight in the darkness. Confusion ran rampant through the ranks, and then faded away as both sides pulled back, except for Herring, whose brigade would remain out front until 3 a.m. General Meade fumed with anger about how the day's actions went. He targeted nearly everyone in his complaints to his aide. Burnside moved too slowly. Sedgwick hadn't come up soon enough. Warren was hesitant and cautious, and he even believed that the always dependable Hancock had failed to take the initiative in his movements toward the Union position on the Brock Road. Anderson and Ewell's men got their men quickly to the field and prepared breastworks when placed on line next to their comrades. The next day, May 9th, Burnside would make it to the Union left flank, and Hancock made it to the right flank. Hoping to turn the Confederate left flank and capture a rebel wagon train rumbling along the Shady Grove Road, Grant and Meade ordered Hancock to attack across the Po River. First, just a few brigades went across, fighting with Confederate cavalry. More brigades went across on orders from the Army commander. However, Ambrose Wright's Confederate brigade of Georgians, also guarding the wagon train, stood in the way of the Federal Corps. Once the wagon train made it across the Blockhouse Bridge, Wright pulled back across the bridge as well. Grant instructed Hancock to cross the bridge, but by the time his corps was prepared to cross, it was 10 p.m. Hancock sent a message to Meade requesting orders. Meade told Hancock to prepare to cross at first light on May 10th. May 9th had been for the most part quiet, except for the attacks by Hancock. Both sides dug in for protection. John Sedgwick, the 6th Corps commander, was placing his troops near where the two branches of the Brock Road converged, where the opening phase of the battle erupted. Sharpshooters played havoc in that area, especially Confederate sharpshooters. Sedgwick noticed that a regiment from New Jersey had been placed in front of some artillery, and ordered his aide to move them out of the way so the artillery could fire without hitting their own men. As the men began throwing up breastworks, sharpshooter bullets began to whiz by the men's heads. The Federal soldiers jumped for cover. Sedgwick saw this and stated, "What? What? Men dodging this way for single bullets? What will you do when they open fire along the whole line? I am ashamed of you. They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance." A moment later, Sedgwick tumbled from his saddle, shot just below the left eye, killing him instantly. Meade placed Horatio Wright, the senior division commander, as commander of the 6th Corps. Previous to the Overland Campaign, Wright served as an engineer overseeing the building of fortifications around Washington, D.C. and along the coast. Then he was sent west in 1862. There he commanded the Department of the Ohio until being replaced by Ambrose Burnside. In May 1863, Wright would come back east and be given a division command in Sedgwick's 6th Corps just in time for the Gettysburg Campaign. Grant, Meade, and Lee's plans for May 10th would make a bloody day during the Overland Campaign, as each side tried to exploit a weakness in the other. As the sun rose over the Spotsylvania battlefield on the morning of May 10th, Winfield Scott Hancock and his 2nd Corps were preparing to attack the Confederate left flank at Blockhouse Bridge. However, 11 pieces of artillery and William Mahone's division guarded the crossing. Hancock sent word back to George Meade and Ulysses S. Grant, informing them of the stiff resistance at the bridge, but agreed to attack if ordered to. Meanwhile, Robert E. Lee sent Henry Heath's division of A.P. Hill's corps, which was temporarily under the command of Jubal Early, to the Confederate left, hoping to outflank the flankers. Part of John Brooks' brigade and John Crocker's brigade marched south to find potential fords across the Po River. Crocker ran into part of Heath's division, and Brooke found a crossing, put one brigade across, formed it into battle line, but it wasn't adequate enough to move the entire corps across that ford. Crocker's men and Brooks' men returned to the Shady Grove Church Road with the rest of the 2nd Corps. Also that morning, Grant telegraphed Washington asking for as many men and ammunition as Henry Halleck could scrape together. The entire morning of May 10th, Governor K. Warren and Horatio Wright probed the Confederates in their front, attempting to find a weak spot, but every skirmish line or regiment he sent forward came back with the same assessment. The Confederates were dug in and in full strength, except on Wright's left front, which put up less resistance than the others. The division of Gershom Mott from Hancock's 2nd Corps was supposed to form a link between Wright's left flank and Ambrose Burnside's right flank. Burnside had crossed the Nye River and was now about a mile and a half from the courthouse, but he stayed idle that morning into the early afternoon. Although, during the skirmishing with Wilcox's Confederate division, one of Burnside's division commanders, Thomas Stevenson, was shot in the back of the head, killing him instantly. Daniel Leisure would take over command of the division, with Gilbert Robinson taking command of Leisure's brigade. With the information from Wright that the Confederate position around the McCool House possessed less troops than the other sectors, Grant believed that Lee was shifting troops to deal with Hancock's corps. To stop this, Grant wanted Wright, Warren, and Hancock to attack the sector held by Charles Field's division at 5 p.m. Hancock pulled all but Barlow's men away from the flank in order to assemble his corps for the large assault. Neither Hancock nor Grant realized that Heath's division was already on the move and ready to strike Hancock's now isolated division. It was afternoon when Heath's skirmishers made themselves known to Barlow's division, and Barlow could tell by the pressure that it was more than just a skirmish line. He informed Hancock, who informed Meade, about the approaching infantry. Meade wanted Hancock to bring Barlow to the north side of the Po River. At 2 p.m., Barlow brought 3 of his brigades back toward the river to protect them in case of an attack and protect the river crossing. At 2:30, Heath attacked. The bloody engagement saw the Confederates attack the Union position 3 times, with the 3rd time resulting in hand-to-hand fighting, but nothing was budging the Federal troops. Heath's men pulled back a little distance and skirmished from long range. Heath's corps commander, Jubal Early, brought up artillery which peppered Barlow's position, igniting the forest and turning it into a blazing inferno. The smoke and flames became too much for the blue troops, and they began to pull back from their position. Early ordered Heath to make another attack, and when Heath told Early that his men were out of ammunition, Early said for him to holler them across. Heath's troops charged Barlow's division and sent them to the other side of the river. A member of the 52nd New York, to avoid breathing in the smoke, put a blanket over his head and sprinted for 150 yards to the river crossing. He admitted that he hit a few trees along the way, but made it to safety. Some regiments made an organized retreat and some ran for their lives, but nevertheless extracting Barlow's men from danger was an incredible feat, and Hancock and Barlow were praised for their abilities. Not knowing that the Federals were ordered to retreat, Heath and Early both claimed to have drove them from the field, and although the attacks and flames did push the Federals back, the reason they didn't stay and fight was because Hancock ordered them back across the river. Brigadier General John Cook, the brother-in-law of Jeb Stuart, suffered a minor wound to the leg, which didn't make him leave the field, but Henry Walker's wound did. Robert Mayo replaced him in command. In preparation for their 5 p.m. assault, Warren's troops pushed in the Confederate skirmishers and formed battle lines. Because of the precarious nature in no man's land between the lines, Warren petitioned Meade to let the attack begin at 4 p.m. against Grant's earlier orders. Meade agreed, and Grant knew about the change in plans but didn't give a rebuttal. The Union troops didn't like the looks of the positions they were supposed to take. One Union soldier wrote, "The enemy had cut down all the trees in front of his position, felling them outward and trimming the branches, thus forming an impenetrable abattis that the Union soldiers could not enter. Behind this tangle, stretched to the right and left, were elaborate fortifications several feet high, manned by Confederate riflemen, who poured a destructive fire upon the division as it was uncovered from the woods. The Union brigades rushed forward at around 4 p.m. and were met with withering fire from the rebel breastworks. One rebel artilleryman explained that his piece used double canister every time it fired, destroying the Federal lines before they could even reach the breastworks. The beleaguered troops fell back to the safety of their own works. Before Warren moved up the time of the attack, Hancock was supposed to oversee the attack, but Barlow's scrape across the Po River delayed him from that duty. Hancock arrived on the field about 5:30 to reform the scattered ranks and inform the brigades that another attack would be made at 6. Meade pushed the time back to 7 p.m. More Union brigades were now on the field, and at 7 they stepped off against the rebel fortifications, but this time there was little success. Hobart Ward's brigade broke through John Gregg's battle line. However, the success was short-lived, and Gregg and Anderson counterattacked, and the second Union assault came to a bloody end, again in failure. These weren't the only attacks scheduled for May 10th. A main assault destined for the salient in the Confederate line called the Muleshoe was also a target. The Muleshoe, formed around the McCool House, was 1,800 yards wide and 1,300 yards deep. Lee called it a wretched line, but Ewell assured him that he could hold it, so Lee kept Ewell's corps there. As the battle developed, the Confederate troops in that corps conformed to the terrain as they were deployed, and what emerged was that salient. Large oak trees were cut down and stacked on top of one another to breast height, and trenches dug to give the men added protection. A Union engineer scouted the Muleshoe and found that troops could attack the northwest sector by remaining unseen in the trees until close to the fortifications. Colonel Emory Upton, a young officer with amazing potential, was chosen to lead the attack, commanding 12 regiments placed in columns to give the attack depth. Upton was told, "Upton, you are to lead those men upon the enemy's works this afternoon. If you do not carry them, you are not expected to come back. But if you carry them, I am authorized to say that you will get your stars." Upton replied, "I will carry those works. If I don't, I will not come back." Each row of regiments were given orders that would hopefully open up a gap in the Confederate line and exploit it, allowing more troops to rush in. Gershom Mott's division was also to attack to relieve pressure from Upton's attack, but they attacked earlier in the day and wouldn't join the assault. For a good while, Upton instructed Union artillery to bombard the Confederate position. Then, about 6:30 p.m., the Union regiments emerged from the trees and advanced toward the Muleshoe against George Dole's Georgians. A Union soldier remembered, "The enemy sitting in their pits with pieces upright, loaded, and with bayonets fixed, ready to impale the first who should leap over, absolutely refused to yield the ground. Others, seeing the fate of their comrades, held their pieces at arm's length and fired downward, while the others, poising with their pieces vertically, hurled them down upon their enemy, pinning them to the ground. Upton's men surged over the breastworks, impaling many with the bayonet. The artillery positioned to Dole's left raked Upton's line with canister, but its officer called on the pieces to cease firing when their comrades were charging. As the artillerymen gave a cheer, they looked out over the field and saw that their fellow gray-clad comrades were indeed running, but they didn't have any muskets. Nearly whole companies were captured by Upton's men, and they were now running to the rear as prisoners of war. The Union regiments fanned out, opening the gap wider to allow their comrades to surge into the breach. Captain Benjamin Smith, commanding 4 artillery pieces to the left of Dole's, lost part of his foot a year before and could only hobble. Now that the blue troops were fanning out in all different directions, it was every man for himself. A large Union soldier picked up Smith, threw him over his shoulder like a sack of flour, and carried him off as a prisoner. Confederate troops from all around the Muleshoe converged on the breach and began beating back the Union assault columns. A bloody and terrible struggle over the newly captured ground left dead and dying strewn all over the works. A member of Upton's columns remembered, "It was but a shattered remnant of that noble column which rushed from the woods against the hostile works, and finding that reinforcements were reaching the enemy, while our columns were every moment melting away, a retreat was ordered." Upton and his division commander, David Russell, ordered the retreat from the field. The Union soldiers resented having to leave their dead and wounded in the hands of the Confederate troops, but without support there was little else to be done. The historian of the 121st New York summarized the action by writing, "Upton's formation, arrangement, and conduct of the assaulting columns was superb. There was not a single miscarry in the whole affair. The men behaved with splendid courage and skill, which had made them famous throughout the army. The rebels fought desperately and were accounted as good as there were in Lee's army." Lee called Rhodes to the McCool House and asked the division commander, "What shall we do with General Doles for allowing those people to break over his lines?" Rhodes may have felt that Lee's comment was also a rebuke of himself and said, "We shall have to let Doles off this time." Near the end of the day, and at about the same time that Upton and his men were fighting for their lives, Burnside on the far Union left flank gave a half-hearted and slow-moving attempt at engaging the Confederates around Spotsylvania Court House, but he would fall back to his original position near the Nye River. The Army of the Potomac's medical director, Dr. Thomas McFarland, recorded over 4,000 casualties on May 10th alone for the Union, and an estimated 2,500 for the Confederacy. May 10th had been the bloodiest day for both armies since leaving the Wilderness. Union Cavalry Commander Philip Sheridan met with the Army of the Potomac Commander George Meade and had a heated exchange. They had already gotten off on a wrong foot when Sheridan took the bulk of the cavalry and left the Army of the Potomac to fend for itself at the Battle of the Wilderness, and now Sheridan laid out a new plan to Meade: concentrate all the cavalry and move out in force against Jeb Stuart's command and whip it. Sheridan wanted to pull Stuart away from the fight around Spotsylvania Court House, bring his command out in the open, and utterly destroy the mounted arm of the Army of Northern Virginia. Stuart provided Lee with great information and screened his movements incredibly well, and Sheridan knew that if he eliminated Stuart's force, he would make Lee blind on the battlefield and on the campaign. Meade went to Ulysses S. Grant, commander of all Union forces, and relayed the conversation he had with Sheridan. Grant responded, "Let him start right out and do it." In the evening on May 8th, Sheridan called his commanders together and said, "We are going out to fight Stuart's cavalry in consequence of a suggestion from me. We are strong, and I know we can beat him. And in view of my recent representations to General Meade, I shall expect nothing but success." Sheridan readied his corps, 3 whole divisions, made up of 10,000 horsemen in all, and 6 batteries of horse artillery, and moved out at 6 a.m. on May 9th, as Lee and Grant were jockeying for position at Spotsylvania Court House. Jeb Stuart, commander of the cavalry for the Army of Northern Virginia, learned about the movement of Sheridan's corps at about 8 a.m., and quickly dispatched Brigadier General William Wickham's brigade to nip at the heels of Sheridan's long column. Stuart formed an audacious plan, made even more so because his force was a small fraction of Sheridan's entire cavalry corps. Stuart would use Lunsford Lomax's brigade of Fitzhugh Lee's division and James Gordon's brigade of Rooney Lee's division to hopefully bring the large Union force to battle somewhere north of Richmond. Stuart mistakenly believed Sheridan was aiming for Richmond, but Sheridan was, instead, aiming for Stuart. Later in the day on May 9th, the 2 other brigades set out after Sheridan. By the night of the 9th, Wesley Merritt's division was already at Beaver Dam Station, recapturing some Federal soldiers who were on their way to Richmond for imprisonment and destroying part of the railroad around the station. Sheridan moved out of Beaver Dam Station on the morning of May 10th and continued south to Ground Squirrel Bridge, where he and his command rested. Stuart, on the other hand, didn't have that luxury. He wanted to push on to Yellow Tavern and turn Sheridan away from the capital, but Fitzhugh Lee refused to go any further without rest. Stuart allowed for about 5 hours of rest, and by 3 a.m. on May 11th, the Confederate cavalry pushed on to Yellow Tavern with his 2 brigades from Fitzhugh Lee's division. Sheridan awoke on the morning of May 11th, left David M. Gregg's division at Ground Squirrel Bridge, and moved the other 2 divisions toward Yellow Tavern. At Ground Squirrel Bridge, Gordon skirmished with Gregg's men, and Gregg even sent one brigade to Ashland Station to destroy what it could of that location and the railroad. Gregg thought that by destroying the Ground Squirrel Bridge that it would stop Gordon, but the Confederate general found what was considered an impassable ford and dashed across, driving Gregg's cavalry away, but suffering great casualties as the fight devolved into a pistol and saber battle. On the morning of May 11, 1864, Jeb Stuart, the flamboyant cavalryman, seemed subdued. His chief of staff remembered that he was more quiet than usual, softer, and more communicative. Earlier, he mentioned that he didn't expect to survive the war, and he would rather not live in a conquered South. His chief of staff concluded that it seemed now that the shadow of the near future was already upon him. Stuart was only 7 miles from Richmond while at Yellow Tavern. He sent a note to Braxton Bragg, Confederate President Jefferson Davis's military advisor, asking if he thought Richmond's defenses could handle Sheridan. If so, Stuart would wait and attack Sheridan in the flank. Bragg wrote back that his defenses could throw back Sheridan, but Stuart wouldn't receive the response until 2 p.m., after he was already engaged with Sheridan. Lomax aligned his brigade on the Telegraph Road with his artillery on his right flank. Skirmishers were thrown out in front of his line. Stuart knew that Wickham's brigade would soon arrive and Bragg's troops from Richmond would be coming from the south, so hopefully they together could box in Sheridan and destroy him. Sheridan's troops under Merritt attacked Lomax's position. As Stuart and Lomax observed the battle from a high point north of Lomax's line, the outnumbered rebel horsemen were holding their own. Stuart sent an aide to Colonel Henry Clay Pate, who commanded the battle line as Lomax was with Stuart, to tell the officer to hold at all hazards. When the aide arrived, he found that the situation was deteriorating. What looked like a stubborn stand from afar turned out to be chaos within the Confederate ranks. The aide told Pate the orders. I can see Colonel Pate now as he stood, looking me square in the eye with his cold gray eyes and pallid face, but uttering no response. Thinking that he had not heard me, I leaned over my horse closer to him and spoke louder, repeating the order. The colonel still did not respond, but the aide saw he had heard and understood my orders in their full significance, as it was a veritable death sentence. The Union regiments broke the flanks of Pate's line and nearly surrounded the 5th Virginia, the only regiment still left from the battle line. The other 2 regiments retreated to the east side of the Telegraph Road, and Wickham's brigade arrived to give support. Pate remained with the 5th Virginia. He yelled, "One more round, boys, then we'll get to the hill." Then a bullet smashed into his forehead, killing him instantly. About 200 men from the 5th Virginia surrendered as the blue troops swarmed over the area. The messenger now arrived from Bragg at 2 p.m., informing Stuart that Richmond's defenses could hold against Sheridan. Sheridan had sent 2 regiments and an artillery battery south to Richmond to stop any reinforcements from getting to Stuart, but they found none. Stuart's command was alone. At 3 p.m., Stuart sent another message to Bragg. Now, General, if we can make a combined attack on them with Hunton's brigade, I cannot see how they can escape. I have attacked once and feel confident of success. They drove our extreme left back a little, but we have been driving their rear and left. As soon as Gordon joins my right, I will try them again, and expect to get so as to command the intersection. The enemy fights entirely as infantry today, though yesterday we got in with sabers with good execution. I am glad to report enemies killed large in proportion. The communication was filled with inaccuracies that downplayed the situation, as well as optimism. Not long after his message was sent, Stuart got word from Gordon that he had defeated Sheridan's force at Ground Squirrel Bridge. Stuart shouted, "Bull for Gordon," then lowered his head and mumbled, "I wish he was here." Sheridan used the lull in the battle to realign his troops. The troops on either side of the Telegraph Road were dismounted cavalry, but he chose 3 mounted regiments, the 1st Michigan, 7th Michigan, and 1st Vermont Cavalry regiments, to charge and take the Confederate battery on the road in the center of Stuart's line. One soldier recalled, "In all directions over the field, regiments or brigades, upon the trot or gallop, in columns of 4s, companies, squadrons, or battalions, with batteries galloping into position, and here and there reserves drawn up in line as straight and motionless as stone walls." A heavy rain began to fall, and lightning flashed through the sky as the Union soldiers advanced and charged. The Michiganders captured half of the artillery battery, with the other half limbering up and pulling away in time. But the Confederate line was now split. Stuart needed to seal the breach. He brought up the reserves, and the sudden appearance of Virginia horsemen blunted the Michiganders' momentum. Stuart remained at the front, attempting to help seal the breach, emptying his revolver into the oncoming blue masses. A Michigander named John A. Huff spotted an officer on horseback and shot him with his revolver. It was Stewart. The bullet entered his left side just above the belt, passed through his stomach, and came out his back. The commander of Company K of the 1st Virginia caught Stewart as he slipped off his saddle. Stewart told the officer to save his men. As the wounded cavalier was taken to an ambulance destined for Richmond, he saw some of his men running. He yelled, go back, and do your duty as I have done mine, and our country will be safe. Go back, I had rather die than be whipped." Stewart would pass away the next day from his wounds. Fitzhugh Lee, now in command of the Confederate cavalry on the field, extracted his troops from the desperate situation, fighting a rearguard action that stubbornly held Sheridan's men at bay until darkness allowed them to get north of the Chickahominy River to rest. Soon, Sheridan was back on the move, first crossing the Chickahominy after a sharp fight with Fitzhugh Lee and Confederate infantry coming from Richmond. He then moved back across the Chickahominy at Bottom's Bridge. After leaving the outskirts of Richmond, the ride was fairly uneventful because Confederates turned their attention away from him once he turned away from Richmond. Sheridan made it to Haxall's Landing and the safety of Benjamin Butler's Army of the James on May 14th. His ride had been a success. He drew a large segment of Lee's cavalry away from Spotsylvania Court House, eliminated Jeb Stuart, Lee's eyes and ears, and threatened Richmond. As Union General Philip Sheridan and Confederate General Jeb Stuart battled at Yellow Tavern on May 11th, just a few miles north of Richmond, Union Generals Ulysses S. Grant and George Meade planned their next assault against Robert E. Lee's lines, directing their attention toward the Muleshoe, a salient in Lee's lines. Grant instructed 2nd Corps Commander Winfield Scott Hancock to move his corps from the right flank to the center around the Brown House. Union Colonel Emory Upton led 12 regiments in an assault that broke the Confederate line at that salient on May 10th, and now Grant planned to use the entire 2nd Corps to crush that salient. Confederate Army Commander Robert E. Lee received word of the enemy movements. Lee was adept at recognizing patterns and predicting how Union commanders would act in situations, but this information led him to a great miscalculation. He mistook the Army movements as meaning Grant was moving east to Fredericksburg to start a new advance toward Richmond. Lee conferred with his corps commanders and decided that if Grant was on the move, then they should strike the Union Army as it moved. He planned to use Ewell's corps to perform this strike, and because the heavy rains made movement slow, ordered Ewell to pull all but 8 artillery pieces away from the Muleshoe. Over 20 cannons rolled away from the salient. Confederate General Edward Johnson commanded most of the troops at the Muleshoe and was astonished to see the pieces roll away. During the evening of May 11th and into the night, Johnson could hear troops marching, halting, and chopping bushes and trees in front of the salient. Some kind of assault was imminent. He went to his corps commander, Richard Ewell, and requested the artillery pieces returned. Ewell ordered them back, but rain delayed the message from getting to his artillery chief and delayed the movement of the pieces back to the salient. The movement of troops heard by Johnson was Hancock's 3 divisions moving into place. Hancock met with his division commanders about 7 p.m. and informed them about their 4 a.m. planned assault. The Union soldiers were already tired. One staffer wrote, "The movement was necessarily slow with frequent halts, at which time the men, worn out by loss of sleep and the terrible nervous and physical strain they had endured during the past 8 days, would drop down for a moment's rest and be asleep as soon as they touched the ground." The front of the marching columns got to the Brown House about 12:30 a.m. Francis Barlow, one of Hancock's division commanders, yelled to a 2nd Corps aide, "For heaven's sake, at least face us in the right direction, so that we shall not march away from the enemy and have to go around the world and come up in the rear." Hancock's corps was packed tightly, with Barlow's division in front, David Birney's division behind them, and John Gibbon's division in the rear. 5 paces separated the regiments, and 10 paces separated brigades. Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps also formed up to add weight to Hancock's attack, determined to link up with the 2nd Corps' left flank. These troops were poised for a massive assault. 20,000 troops were in Hancock's corps alone. Hancock's troops were aroused about 3:30 a.m. The 2nd Corps commander asked Meade for a delay since a dense fog covered the landscape. Meade agreed, and Hancock waited until 4:30. The attack began with the divisions moving forward. The Pioneer Corps, armed with axes, walked behind the skirmish line to remove any major obstacles in the way. A soldier from Massachusetts remembered, Neither drum to beat the charge nor bugle to sound the call, none of the accessories that usually accompany warlike forces and give to them pomp and circumstance to fill the eye and feed the imagination were here. There were no officers on horseback, hurrying hither and thither, in front or on either flank, giving life, color, and imagination to the field with their clattering sabers, waving plumes, and brilliant uniforms. Neither were there any picturesque groups of them in the background. Everyone was on foot, for all horses were left behind the lines. James Walker, commander of the Stonewall Brigade, recalled, "The heavy tramp of a large body of infantry and the sharp words of command could be distinctly heard. Very soon our skirmishers came falling back, firing as they came, and announced, what we already knew, that a heavy column was advancing to the attack. Our men were all up and ready for them with their muskets cocked, peering through the gloom for the first glimpse of their foes. Hancock's left, because of the darkness in which the men formed for the assault, was going to overshoot the Muleshoe, but its officers swung it so that it would hit the northeastern portion of the Muleshoe. When they did so, a gap emerged, and Robert McAllister's brigade of Mott's division filled the hole. When the Confederate soldiers pulled their triggers to let loose volleys into the approaching Federal soldiers, all that sounded was the percussion cap, as the rain had fouled their weapons and prevented them from discharging. This greatly affected the Stonewall Brigade, but others, who kept their powder dry, were able to send a volley of death into the blue ranks. Without artillery to deliver destruction to the Federals, those Union troops charged into the Confederate works. Before the attack, Hancock ordered his men to fix bayonets and not to stop to fire, so when his troops made it to the enemy entrenchments, it broke down into hand-to-hand fighting. George Maryland Stewart, commander of a brigade that encountered Barlow's division, was captured in the melee. Confederate division commander Edward Johnson, seeing his men desperately fighting, joined them in the combat, wielding his cane against Federal soldiers with fixed bayonets. Eventually, Johnson grabbed a rifled musket and knocked down 15 men before the Union soldiers overpowered him. Captured, Johnson ordered his men to surrender and called out to his enemy not to shoot his troops. The weight of the Union corps was too much, and the Confederate line collapsed. However, the success of the attack led to confusion within the Second Corps ranks. Units lost all cohesion and became more of a mob of soldiers than brigades and divisions. Barlow wrote years later that, "What ought to have been done was plain. We had carried the enemy's line at its extreme right and practically destroyed its defenders. The occasion for charging, for rush and confusion, was past, and troops ought to have been soberly and deliberately put in position and ordered to sweep down the rebel line towards his left while provision was made to guard against an attack by the enemy's second line, or the remnant of his defeated troops, upon the ground which we had taken." Johnson's division had basically melted away. It entered the wilderness a few weeks prior with over 5,000 men. Now it numbered a little over 1,000, a loss of 78%. To the southeast, Burnside's corps was on the move against the east side of the Muleshoe. The 23rd and 37th Virginia of Maryland Stewart's brigade and the 28th North Carolina of James Lane's brigade were pushed back by Barlow's men and Burnside's approaching troops, but the rest of Lane's North Carolinians held the Union attacks at bay, doggedly holding on to their ground. New Confederate Division Commander John B. Gordon was Lee's reserves, and reports came in that unusual activity was to the north. He formed Robert Johnson's brigade and moved it forward to hopefully stem the tide of the Union advance. When he did, Johnston himself was gravely wounded, putting Thomas Garrett in command. The North Carolinians were hit by gunfire on 3 sides and forced to fall back to safety. Gordon, knowing that he needed to buy General Lee some time, ordered Garrett to attack again, but this time spread out his brigade to section off the Federals from penetrating the Confederate line any further. Garrett did as he was asked and moved his men forward. Again, the Federal gunfire hit the Tar Heels from 3 sides. Even stretching the brigade out didn't make it big enough to cordon off the Federals. Garrett was killed in the action, and Thomas Toone replaced him. The brigade withdrew to safety and awaited additional reinforcements. More were on the way. Gordon gathered Clement Evans' brigade and John Hoffman's Virginians to come to the scene of the action. Lee calmly surveyed the situation as Johnson's men came streaming south. He then rode to Evans and Hoffman's troops. Standing in the middle of them, he removed his hat and turned his horse Traveler toward the enemy. The Georgians told him that they didn't want him killed. Gordon claimed that he grabbed Traveler's bridle and said, "You must not expose yourself. Your life is too valuable to the army and to the Confederacy for you to risk it so wantonly. We are Georgians. We are Virginians. We need no such encouragement." Gordon led the brigades against the fast-approaching mob of blue soldiers. The Federals didn't give up the ground easily, and a volley flew between the 2 sides. but the more organized Confederates stood more solidly than the loose group of Federals. Confederate brigades, not encountering any enemy forces in their front, were pulled out of the line and rushed toward the now occupied breastworks. Hand-to-hand fighting resulted as Hancock's troops didn't want to give up what they had captured. Northern troops still occupied the northernmost sector of the Muleshoe and poured lead into the flanks of the Confederates who recaptured the works. Human gore filled the water puddles caused by the heavy rains. Men used bayonets, the butts of their rifles, and their very fists to attack one another. Every now and then the muskets would fire and more dead and dying men would pile up higher and higher in the Confederate breastworks. It was now 6 a.m., and Hancock knew that his troops would be completely pushed away from the rebel works if reinforcements didn't emerge. Thomas Neal's division from Horatio Wright's 6th Corps approached the northwest sector of the Muleshoe to give aid to Hancock's beleaguered troops. However, Ramser's North Carolinians blocked their advance, so the blue troops threw up breastworks and engaged in long-distance exchanges of musketry, all the while ducking behind their hastily made breastworks to avoid artillery fire. When Johnson's line broke, Lee called for William Mahone's division, who guarded the Army's left flank, to come east and help seal the breach. The lead elements arrived about 7 a.m. in a driving rain. Abner Perrin's brigade arrived first. Seeing the chaos in front of them, Perrin remarked, "I shall come out of this fight a live Major General or a dead Brigadier." Gordon guided the Alabamians where they were most needed, and Perrin charged into the breach. The brigade lost all cohesion because of the hectic charge and the fact that Perrin, their leader, was shot off his horse, wounded multiple times, and died from blood loss when a bullet nicked his femoral artery. The brigade broke up into pieces, with many of the men caught in a crossfire from their comrades behind them and enemy troops in front of them. So they hunkered down into some secondary works, awaiting an opportunity to make it to safety. Nathaniel Harris's Mississippi Brigade was next. Near the McCool House, they saw General Lee. An artillery shell passed by Traveler's stirrups, and a member of the brigade yelled out to Lee, "Can't you trust us?" General Lee replied, "Yes, I can trust you. Go, and may God go with you." Others yelled, go back, General Lee. For God's sake, go back." Lee stood up in his stirrups and yelled, "Mississippians, I go back under one condition, and that is that you go forward. Remember that you strike for Mississippi today." Harris charged his men to the right of Ramser's brigade, pushing back more Union troops from the entrenchments, but the gap in the line still remained. On the Union side, communication and cohesion broke down further. Lewis Grant's Vermont Brigade made it to the left of Hancock's line and then moved forward, entering the breastworks of Barlow's division, causing more chaos in the blue ranks, as now Barlow would have to separate his division from that brigade. He rode back to Hancock and told him of the confusion and said not to send any more reinforcements, that it would only make his ranks less coherent. The men from Vermont were supposed to go further southeast to link up with Burnside's right flank, but the orders were vague, so they moved into Barlow's lines. McGowan's South Carolinians from Wilcox's division of A.P. Hill's Corps was the next Confederate brigade to make it to the Muleshoe. The brigade was prepared to reclaim their reputation after the disaster at the Wilderness and rushed in. Charles Wilden of the 1st South Carolina carried the flag for his regiment. He was afflicted with epilepsy and couldn't keep up with his regiment, but went into the fight anyhow. When a bullet hit him in the shoulder and another broke his flagpole, he ripped the flag from the staff, wrapped it around himself, and charged into the breach. McGowan's men pushed the blue troops out of the northernmost sector of the Muleshoe, regaining all of the lost ground from the early morning attack by Hancock's 2nd Corps. The brigade lost its commander McGowan to an arm wound, and his replacement was killed nearly as soon as he took command, so command went to Joseph Brown of the 14th South Carolina. Emory Upton's brigade charged the reclaimed Confederate works and lost significant casualties in the attempt. His lead regiment lost 100 men just getting to the front because the musketry and artillery fire was so deadly. The brigade fell back with the rest of the 2nd Corps and part of the 6th Corps. Another brigade from the 6th Corps was also preparing for its own assault. Henry Brown's New Jersey Brigade fell on the right of Upton's brigade, and then attempted to hit Harris's brigade by going in between the Union and Confederate lines. The Southern soldiers played havoc on the right flank of the brigade. Miraculously, they made it to the Confederate entrenchments, and it quickly devolved into hand-to-hand combat, but the enormous casualties sustained during the attack made the brigade fall apart rather quickly. A man in that brigade recalled the scene later. "Terrific day of awful, murderous conflict. Combine the horrors of many battlefields, bring them into a single day and night of 24 hours, and the one of May 12th includes them all." One Union soldier remembered that dead rebels were piled in the entrenchments 3 to 4 bodies deep, and the rain only made life in the trenches worse as men strove to fire their easily fouled muskets. A Union soldier remembered, "The rebels were on one side of the breastwork and we on the other. We could touch their guns with ours. They would load, jump up, and fire into us, and we did the same to them. Almost every shot that was made took effect." Another wrote, "Our men fought the rebels close to the other side of the breastworks and knocked their guns aside, and jumped up in the works and shot them down." It was now just after 12 noon, and the battle for the Muleshoe broke down into a bitter stalemate, with neither side giving in. Lee knew that his men couldn't hold that position much longer, and ordered what troops were available to construct a second set of earthworks south of the Harrison home. Lee hoped that his men could hold out until this new line was constructed. During the fight for the Muleshoe, commander of all Union forces Ulysses S. Grant and Army of the Potomac commander George Meade urged the 5th, 6th, and 9th Corps commanders to attack along their front to help relieve pressure on Hancock's 2nd Corps, attempting to hold the Muleshoe, but none of the 3 corps attacked vigorously. Governor K. Warren's poor performance caused Grant to seek a replacement for the corps commander, but Meade intervened and asked Grant not to replace Warren. Ambrose Burnside and his 9th Corps' weak attacks on the morning of May 12th didn't relieve the pressure on Hancock's front, and now that Hancock's men were now in a stalemate outside the Confederate fortifications, something needed to break that stalemate. The Union and Confederate soldiers could touch rifles, they were so close, and individuals would jump up and fire into the other's works at point-blank range, then dive back into their entrenchments to load their rifles again. To break the stalemate, Grant wanted the battle to shift further east along Burnside's front. Burnside delayed, preferring to wait and see if an opportunity emerged, rather than attacking as ordered. After hours and repeated encouragement by Grant to move his men, Burnside prepared his men to attack around 2 p.m. On the Confederate side, Army Commander Robert E. Lee also sought to end the stalemate, knowing his troops couldn't hold out much longer. His engineers and available troops were constructing fortifications south of the Muleshoe, and an attack elsewhere might relieve pressure on that salient. Lee chose the same front that Grant chose to relieve the stalemate, the Confederate right flank near Spotsylvania Court House. One of Burnside's divisions moved out a little after 2 p.m. His troops advanced near the Confederate lines and then fell to the ground to avoid the bombardment let loose by the Confederate artillery at a salient known as Heath Salient that bristled with artillery. Lee arrived on the field and assessed the situation. Burnside's open left flank gave Lee an opportunity to defeat Burnside and to hopefully relieve pressure on the Muleshoe. He sent James Lane's North Carolinians and David Weisinger's Virginians to approach Burnside's left flank. The Confederate sudden attack threw the Union troops into confusion. Artillery shells hit their front as musketry riddled their flank. The regiments on the immediate left broke quickly, while the ones to the right attempted to blunt the attack. Lane, after breaking up part of the flank, turned his attention to the artillery pieces, which blew holes in his line. The Tar Heels captured some of the pieces, but the retreating Federals ran through their left flank, resulting in some hand-to-hand combat and confusing his battle line. With no way to carry away the cannons and the Union attack coming to an end, the Confederate brigades withdrew to their entrenchments, and Burnside's attack ended. Although a few Union troops made it to within 50 yards of the Confederate line, the attacks were a failure. The fight for the Muleshoe was over. Now each general began to take stock of their commands. It's difficult to estimate the losses for just May 12th, but modern estimates are that the Union lost about 9,000 men, while the Confederacy suffered close to 8,000 casualties in that single day of action. One soldier remembered the scene. "I was able to appreciate the full measure of its horrors. I shrink from the attempt to describe the scene. It was a ghastly and horrible example of the organized brutality that we call war. No language can adequately portray the sickening spectacle. Imagine, if you can, a line of entrenchments 400 yards in length, a solid wall of timber and earth forming its front, with traverses extending at short intervals to the rear, forming 8 or 10 pen-like enclosures, half filled with dead and dying men. They lay in piles, sometimes 5 men deep. Often the dead were lying upon the mortally wounded, who groaned in their death agony and begged for water and prayed for death. Bodies hung from the works in every form of mangling. Blood and mangling were everywhere, and the sickening stench of the battlefield was over it all." Ulysses S. Grant quickly went back on his promise to allow Meade to direct the campaign, Ever since the Wilderness, Grant began to issue direct orders to brigade, division, and corps commanders within the Army of the Potomac, reducing George Meade to what one historian called a high-level staff officer. Out of the 4 corps commanders under Grant, Sedgwick had been killed, replaced with Horatio Wright, who had yet to prove himself at a corps-level command. Governor K. Warren exhibited hesitancy and lack of aggression in every engagement thus far on the campaign. Winfield Scott Hancock also lacked the aggression exhibited before his wounding at Gettysburg, but he was regaining his old ways of handling the Second Corps. But with Warren and Wright's timidity, it was difficult to take advantage of military opportunities like at the Muleshoe. Ambrose Burnside technically outranked Meade, so he answered directly to Grant. Burnside's aggression and quick movements in the East Tennessee campaign seemed to dissipate once he came back east, as displayed with his slowness and outright ignoring of Grant's orders. Robert E. Lee also lacked the officers and qualities needed to fight out the campaign. Out of the 4 corps commanders that he entered the Overland Campaign with, Jeb Stuart was dead, James Longstreet was badly wounded and would not return to the Army for months. A.P. Hill's prostatitis kept him from fighting at Spotsylvania Court House, but he would soon rejoin the ranks despite his debilitating illness. The only moderately healthy corps commander was Richard Ewell, but Lee was having second thoughts about him. At one point, Lee witnessed Ewell unmercifully beating some of the retreating soldiers with the flat end of his sword and cursing them. Lee rode up to him and said, "General Ewell, you must restrain yourself. How can you expect to control these men when you have lost control of yourself? If you cannot repress your excitement, you had better retire." Richard Anderson acted as Longstreet's temporary replacement, but had yet to distinguish himself as a corps commander, and Jubal Early was temporarily replacing A.P. Hill. Lee trusted Early as a division commander, but was still gauging his ability as a corps commander. Not only had Lee lost corps commanders, he had lost 13 brigade commanders thus far and a division commander. It was becoming difficult to find adequate replacements for the lost commanders. By the end of the 12th and into the early hours of the 13th of May, Lee pulled his troops away from the Muleshoe to the new set of entrenchments a little south of the Harrison home. Grant sent troops forward, and they found empty entrenchments, but as they progressed south, they quickly discovered the new position taken up by the rebel soldiers. Now Grant had a decision to make: keep fighting it out along this line, or head east and south to bring Lee to battle a little closer to Richmond. Ultimately, Grant decided to fight it out along this line, but shift his troops to Lee's weak right flank. Throughout the 13th, the 5th and 6th Corps of the Army of the Potomac marched east to the Fredericksburg Road, shifting the battle. Likewise, Lee began moving his troops to combat the growing numbers of Federals on his right flank. Close to the Nye River, a hill called Myers Hill jutted up from the landscape. Both Lee, Meade, and Grant could see the utility in capturing the important location. Confederate horsemen already occupied the hill, with a brigade of cavalry not far away. On May 14th, Meade sent Brigadier General Emory Upton and 2 regiments already on the west side of the river to push the horsemen off the hill, along with the Confederate artillery. They did so, and when they did, this triggered Lee to send 2 brigades of men under Ambrose Wright and Nathaniel Harris down the Massaponax Road to drive the Federals from the hill that overlooked the field of battle. The Confederate infantry, with the cavalry on their right flank, overlapped the Union battle line perched atop Myers Hill. Each side threw volleys into one another, but the rebels gained the advantage and pushed Upton and his men off the hill. Determined to regain and hold the position, Meade issued orders for a division of troops to cross the Nye River and attack the position, but when they got there, the Confederates had already left, leaving it in the hands of Meade's troops. Ulysses S. Grant telegraphed Washington to send all the available troops that could be scraped together. The Overland Campaign was only 10 days old, yet his casualties had mounted to over 30,000. 20,000 troops would be on their way to him very soon, but he still needed to deal with Lee in his front while he waited for reinforcements. Most of his troops had shifted a great deal during the 14th to the 17th of May. Grant believed that Lee's right flank would be weak and ordered Horatio Wright to test that flank, but he ran into stiff resistance and told Grant as much. Grant would come up with another plan. Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps was battered, and Grant believed, with enough pressure and support, he could break that new line that Robert E. Lee formed south of the Harrison home. Through the night of the 17th and into the early morning of the 18th, Wright's 6th Corps and Hancock's 2nd Corps formed in almost their exact same positions as their May 12th attack on the Muleshoe. At 4:30 a.m., Hancock's 3 divisions and 2 of Wright's divisions stepped off toward the new line of Confederate works. It was an early morning attack, but it didn't catch the Confederates off guard. They were ready with guns loaded and artillery trained on the ground in front of them. One soldier remembered the enemy's line of dead had been exposed to the hot rays of the sun for 6 days, and with the intense heat their faces had turned black and putrefaction set in. The line of battle wavered as the horrible sight presented itself to their view, but this was but for a moment, when everyone made an effort to step between the bodies. The march to the Confederate line convinced Brigadier General Joshua Owen that the attack was futile, and he withdrew without ever making contact with the enemy. This action would earn him a court-martial and loss of his command. The rest of the troops continued, but they, along with 2 brigades from Burnside's corps, were subjected to a withering fire from the Confederate entrenchments. The attacks quickly broke down, and the Union brigades got caught in a destructive fire that made them hug the ground for protection. Hancock asked for the attack to be called off, and it was agreed that his troops wouldn't attack anymore. It was difficult, but the troops extricated themselves from the destructive fire of artillery, which had nearly been solely responsible for throwing back the attackers. The attack racked up around 1,500 more casualties for the Union, considerably less for the Confederacy. By the end of the day on the 18th, Grant decided that he would no longer try to break Lee's line. It was far too strong, and he could rush troops to plug any hole that was made by an attack. Grant hoped that if he moved one of his corps away from the battlefield, that Lee would leave his entrenchments to go after it, in an attempt to defeat it while it was alone. Then, as Lee's army moved south, he could bring it to battle outside of fortifications with the other 3 corps. He chose Hancock's corps to maneuver south and try to get to the crossing of the North Anna River. Lee was unsure about Grant's next move. He wrote to President Jefferson Davis that he couldn't attack Grant with his limited resources and tired troops. Richard Ewell's corps reported that there were no Federals in their front, so Lee authorized a reconnaissance in force by Ewell's corps to gauge the disposition of the Union Army. Robert Rhodes and John B. Gordon's divisions left the flank and made their way across the Nye River. No Union forces were in their way until they got across the river. Rhodes's men were in the lead when they came into contact with Robert Tyler's division, made up of heavy artillery units given rifles to fight as infantry. Rhodes's men came into contact with the 2nd New York Heavy Artillery and the 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery. The Bay State Regiment divided itself into 3 battalions to engage with the rebels. The 1st Battalion was overpowered by Ramser's North Carolinians. Hoping to capitalize on his own momentum, Ramser charged the Union line, but as one Union soldier said, the firing was more than human flesh and blood could stand, and the Tar Heels fell back. Ramser would attack the position at least 2 more times, but failed each time. The rest of his division came up, giving him additional support. However, Union reinforcements were also coming to the field. John B. Gordon's division fell onto Rhodes's left flank to hold off the heavy artillery regiments, but Union 2nd Corps troops were overlapping their position. John Crocker's brigade rushed forward and sent back William Terry's Virginians. The Confederate left flank appeared to be caving in, but Gordon sent John Hoffman's brigade to shore up the flank. Darkness was now covering the battlefield, ending the fight at the Harris Farm and the entire Battle of Spotsylvania Court House. From May 8th to the 19th, the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia engaged in a brutal battle that saw some of the most intense fighting of the entire American Civil War. The brutality and the near constant battling make Spotsylvania stand out as the bloodiest battle of the Overland Campaign. Ulysses S. Grant hoped to destroy Robert E. Lee's army, but it hadn't happened. Lee held on, moving troops to fill breakthroughs and rushing reinforcements to vulnerable areas. Neither did Lee destroy Grant's army. In all reality, it was a draw, with both sides claiming victory. Lee had successfully blocked Grant from getting around his flank into Spotsylvania Court House, and Grant bloodied Lee's beleaguered army, inflicting more casualties that Lee couldn't replace. In the end, the Union lost 18,399 men, 2,725 killed, 13,416 wounded, and 2,258 missing and captured. The Confederacy lost 12,687 troops, 1,515 killed, 5,415 wounded, and 5,758 missing and captured. The Overland Campaign was less than 3 weeks old, but had produced over 60,000 casualties.